In the final week of November, a cold morning settled over Millstone, Pennsylvania, where fog covered the industrial district and heavy trucks moved through the gray light before sunrise. Officer Daniel Mercer was nearing the end of his night patrol when he turned onto Foundry Road, a long stretch of pavement that ran past warehouses, loading yards, and abandoned storage buildings. Daniel was 46 years old and had served with the Millstone Police Department for nearly 2 decades. He had once been known as a patient canine handler with a steady voice and a gift for calming frightened animals. Now he worked alone. The dashboard clock showed a little after 6. His shift would end in less than an hour. Daniel drove slowly because the fog had thickened near the river. Moisture gathered across the windshield, and the headlights of approaching trucks appeared as pale circles before vanishing behind him. He had made this drive hundreds of times, often with Ranger sitting upright in the rear compartment of the patrol vehicle. Ranger had been a German Shepherd and Daniel's canine partner for more than 10 years. Even after retirement, the old dog had waited by the door each evening as Daniel prepared for work. Ranger had died 4 months earlier from the quiet failures of old age. Since then, Daniel had avoided looking into the empty rear section of the vehicle. The road curved near a narrow concrete bridge that crossed Millstone Creek. Daniel eased off the accelerator when he noticed a dark shape beside the shoulder. At first, he thought it was a torn bag or a bundle that had fallen from a truck. Then, he saw one of the legs. Daniel slowed, pulled onto the shoulder, and turned on the emergency lights. Red and blue reflections moved across the wet pavement and the metal walls of a nearby warehouse. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, already knowing what he would find. Animals were often left near the industrial road. Some wandered from farms. Others were abandoned by people who believed an empty roadside was kinder than a shelter. Daniel had responded to enough calls to recognize the stillness of an animal that was no longer breathing. He stepped out and pulled his jacket closed against the wind. The dog lay several feet from the road. She was a medium-sized German Shepherd mix, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. Her coat was wet and marked with mud. There was no collar around her neck and no identification tag nearby. Daniel crouched beside her. He did not need to touch her to know she had died, but he placed 2 fingers gently against her neck anyway. The accident appeared to have happened several hours earlier. One of the heavy trucks had probably struck her during the night and continued without stopping. Daniel looked along the road. There were no houses nearby, only a closed machine shop, a fenced lumber yard, and the bridge. "Where did you come from?" he said quietly. The dog gave him no answer. Daniel stood and reached for the radio attached to his shoulder. He intended to report the animal and request assistance from County Animal Control. Before he pressed the button, he heard something beneath the sound of passing tires. It was faint and uneven. Daniel turned toward the creek. For several seconds, the noise disappeared. Then it came again, a thin cry. He walked toward the edge of the road and listened. The sound seemed to come from a drainage ditch that ran beneath the bridge. Dead grass bent over the opening, and rainwater moved in a shallow stream through the concrete channel. Daniel took a flashlight from his belt and climbed down the muddy slope. The cry grew clearer. He crouched near the mouth of the culvert and directed the beam inside. At first, he saw only water, stones, and leaves pressed against the wall. Then, something moved behind a collapsed piece of cardboard. Daniel lowered himself closer. Inside the culvert was a box. It had once been strong enough to carry groceries or household supplies, but the rain had softened the sides until they leaned inward. A faded towel lay across the bottom. Beneath it, several small bodies shifted against one another. Daniel reached into the culvert and pulled the box toward him. 6 puppies lay inside. They appeared to be German Shepherd mixes, no more than 4 weeks old. Their eyes were open, but their movements were weak. Their coats were soaked, and their small bodies trembled from the cold. They were packed together so tightly that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the next began. For a moment, Daniel could only stare. One puppy lifted its head and made the faint sound he had heard from the road. Daniel removed his gloves and touched the nearest animal. The puppy's body was cold. "Easy," he whispered, I've got you." He counted them twice. 6. 4 were larger and pressed close together at the center of the box. 2 smaller puppies lay near the damaged edge. None wore collars. There was no food, water, or note left with them. Daniel looked back toward the road. The mother dog lay less than 30 yards away. The story formed in his mind with painful simplicity. Someone had left the mother and puppies beside the creek, probably during the night. The box had been pushed beneath the culvert for shelter. Hungry and frightened, the mother had eventually climbed toward the road in search of food. She had not returned. Daniel felt anger rise in him, but there was no one nearby to receive it. The people responsible were already gone. The only thing left was the result of their decision. One of the smaller puppies began moving toward the open side of the box. It was a male with a dark muzzle and one ear folded against his head. He dragged himself over the wet towel, slipped through a split in the cardboard, and tried to crawl up the muddy slope. Daniel watched him struggle. The puppy moved only a few inches before stopping. His head remained pointed toward the roadside, toward the place where his mother lay. Daniel's throat tightened. He reached down and lifted the puppy with both hands. It weighed almost nothing. The animal's ribs rose quickly beneath his palms, and its paws pressed weakly against his jacket. "You can't go that way," Daniel said. The puppy gave a small whine and rested its head against Daniel's wrist. For one sharp moment, Daniel remembered Ranger during the final weeks of his life. The old dog had struggled to stand whenever Daniel returned from work. His legs had become unreliable, and his hearing was nearly gone, but he still recognized the sound of the patrol car in the driveway. Daniel would open the door and find Ranger trying to push himself upright, determined to greet his partner as he had done for years. Daniel had always hurried across the room and told him not to move. Ranger had never listened. Even near the end, loyalty had remained stronger than pain. Daniel looked down at the puppy. It had the same stubborn effort in its small body, the same need to follow someone who could no longer return. He carried the box up the slope. The back of the patrol vehicle was designed for a working dog, not 6 newborn puppies. Daniel spread an emergency blanket across the floor, then removed his outer coat and placed it over the puppies. He turned the vehicle heater to its highest setting and left the rear door open long enough to make sure warm air reached them. The smallest puppy continued trembling. Daniel searched the storage compartment and found an old brown jacket folded beneath a first aid bag. It had belonged to Ranger. Daniel had placed it there after the dog retired and never removed it. The jacket still carried a few short strands of dog hair near the sleeve. Daniel hesitated before unfolding it. He had avoided touching Ranger's belongings since the old dog died. The leash remained hanging beside the back door at home. The water bowl still sat in the kitchen cupboard. Even the worn tennis ball beneath Daniel's sofa had been left where Ranger had last pushed it. Now Daniel placed the jacket in the box. The puppies immediately pressed into the fabric. The smallest one turned twice, then curled into the fold near the sleeve. Its shaking gradually eased. Daniel closed the rear door and contacted Millstone County Animal Rescue. The call was answered by Laura Bennett, a 53-year-old intake coordinator who had worked at the county shelter for 12 years. Her voice sounded tired before Daniel finished explaining the situation. 6 puppies, she asked. "And the mother is deceased," Daniel said. "They're about 4 weeks old. Cold, but breathing." Laura was silent for a moment. "We're beyond capacity," she said. "We took in 14 dogs from a property seizure yesterday. Every foster home is full." Daniel looked through the rear window. The puppies were almost hidden beneath Ranger's jacket. "What can you do?" "I can start calling other shelters," Laura replied. "But I need to be honest with you. Nobody nearby has space for an entire litter. They need to stay together." "I understand that." Her pause told him what was coming next. "If we find openings today, it may be 1 puppy here and 2 somewhere else. They could be sent to several counties." Daniel tightened his hand around the phone. "And if you don't find openings? We'll need a temporary foster immediately. Someone who can keep them warm and feed them through the day. They're too young to be left alone for long." Daniel looked toward the bridge, the dead mother, and the endless line of trucks moving through the fog. How long? Possibly one day, possibly longer. Daniel almost laughed, though nothing felt amusing. He worked nights. He had no supplies for newborn puppies. His house was quiet, orderly, and barely managed even by one tired man. "I can keep them for a few hours," he said. "That's all." "A few hours helps," Laura replied. "Bring them somewhere warm. I'll call you as soon as I find options." Daniel ended the call. He reported the mother dog's location to dispatch and requested removal. Then he returned to the driver's seat and sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel. Behind him, 6 puppies shifted inside the box. He should have driven them directly to the station. He should have asked another officer to watch them. He should have kept the situation simple and temporary. Instead, Daniel turned away from the industrial district and headed toward his house. The fog began to lift as the town appeared ahead of him. Closed shops lined Main Street. A bakery worker turned on the lights behind a window. Somewhere, a church bell marked the hour. At a red light, Daniel glanced into the mirror. The smallest puppy was asleep inside Ranger's old jacket. One paw rested across the worn sleeve, as if holding on. Daniel had intended to save 6 puppies for only a few hours. But as the light changed and he drove toward the silent house waiting at the end of Birch Lane, he began to understand that a few hours might not be enough. Daniel's house stood at the quiet end of Birch Lane, where the yards were narrow, the trees had nearly lost their leaves, and most porch lights had already gone dark by the time he arrived home. He carried the wet cardboard box inside with both arms held close to his chest. The 6 puppies barely moved beneath Ranger's old jacket. Their breathing was quick, but at least the trembling had weakened during the drive. Daniel set the box on the kitchen floor and turned up the heat. The house responded with the familiar creak of old pipes. For 4 months, that had been one of the only sounds inside the place. He called the station and explained the situation to Captain Harold Miles, his 58-year-old supervisor, who had led the Millstone night shift for nearly 12 years. Harold listened without interrupting, then gave Daniel permission to keep the puppies temporarily until the county shelter found a better arrangement. "You still need to sleep before tonight," Harold warned. "I know. 6 puppies are not the same as one retired K9. I know that too." Daniel ended the call and looked down at the box. He did not know nearly enough. The small storage room beside the kitchen had once belonged to Ranger. Daniel had removed the dog bed after Ranger died, but the room still held a wooden food stand, a shelf of old training supplies, and several scratches near the door where Ranger had waited impatiently before morning walks. Daniel carried everything unnecessary into the hallway. He spread clean towels across the floor, found a low wooden crate in the garage, and placed it near an electrical outlet. An old portable heating lamp remained on a shelf from a winter when Ranger had injured his hip. Daniel tested it, adjusted the height, and covered half the crate with another towel so the puppies could move away from the warmth if they became uncomfortable. It looked reasonable. That did not mean it was right. He transferred the puppies one at a time. Each felt lighter than he expected. One had a pale patch across its chest. Another had a narrow line of white on one rear paw. The smallest male opened his eyes whenever Daniel moved away and tried to follow, though his legs could barely support him. Daniel filled a shallow bowl with water and placed it inside the crate. None of the puppies touched it. He opened the refrigerator and found milk. He poured some into a cup, warmed it slightly, and stopped before carrying it into the room. Something about the decision felt uncertain. Ranger had come to him fully grown and trained. Daniel understood working dogs, commands, exercise, injuries, and discipline. He knew how to read tension through a dog's ears and shoulders. He could recognize fear before it became aggression. He had never cared for puppies that still needed their mother. Daniel searched through a drawer for the number of a farm supply store on the edge of town. Less than an hour later, he stood beneath the bright lights of Miller's Feed and Grain, staring at a shelf filled with bottles, powders, feeding tubes, and labels that seemed written for people who already understood them. He picked up a carton of whole cow's milk and placed it in his basket. Then he added 6 small bowls, a bag of puppy food, and the smallest nursing bottle he could find. "You don't want that milk." The voice came from behind him. Grace Holloway was 71 years old, a retired farm supply owner who had spent nearly 4 decades helping local families care for horses, calves, barn cats, and newborn dogs. She stood beside a shopping cart containing birdseed, canned soup, and a bag of flour. Her manner was calm, but her eyes had already settled on the items in Daniel's basket. Daniel glanced at the carton. "It's milk." "It is. Just not the right kind. I found 6 puppies." "I guessed that much." Grace took the carton from his basket and returned it to the shelf. She explained that cow's milk could upset their stomachs and worsen dehydration. At 4 weeks old, they might begin eating softened food, but they would still need puppy formula several times a day until their strength returned. Daniel listened closely. Grace handed him a container of milk replacer, 2 feeding bottles with smaller nipples, and a simple thermometer. Then she added absorbent pads, cotton cloths, and a jar of plain electrolyte solution. "You've done this before," Daniel said. "More times than I can count." She looked at him for a moment. "Where did you find them?" "Under the bridge on Foundry Road. Their mother was hit by a truck." Grace's expression changed, though only slightly. "All 6 alive?" "For now." "Then you should go home." Daniel glanced at the growing pile in his basket. "I still don't know what to do with half of this." Grace pushed her own cart toward the register. "I'll show you." He almost refused. He was tired, embarrassed, and unaccustomed to bringing anyone into his home. Then he pictured 6 small bodies waiting beneath the heating lamp and followed her outside. Grace arrived at Birch Lane in an old station wagon that carried more supplies than Daniel had purchased. She brought a plastic storage bin filled with feeding syringes, small blankets, measuring spoons, a kitchen scale, and a notebook with worn corners. "My husband and I kept these after we sold the store," she explained. "We thought someone might need them." Her husband, Walter, had died 7 years earlier. Daniel knew the name, but little else. Grace had lived alone since then in a small house 3 streets away. Inside the storage room, Grace knelt beside the crate and checked each puppy carefully. She tested their gums, felt their stomachs, and examined the skin between their shoulders for dehydration. Her hands were gentle, but efficient. "They're cold, hungry, and tired," she said, "but none of them seem beyond help." Daniel released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Grace showed him how to mix the formula and test it against the inside of his wrist. She warned him not to feed too quickly because a weak puppy could inhale liquid into its lungs. Each puppy had to be held upright, never on its back. Daniel tried with the largest male first. The puppy pushed the nipple away, sneezed, and spilled formula across Daniel's shirt. Grace laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the warm sound of someone watching a difficult lesson begin exactly as expected. "You'll improve," she said. "I was hoping they would. They may have to wait for you." The second attempt went better. The puppy drank slowly, then fell asleep before finishing. Daniel placed him back under the lamp and reached for the next. By late morning, all 6 had eaten something. Grace weighed them and wrote the numbers in her notebook. She drew 6 simple rows across the page and marked feeding times, temperature checks, and bathroom habits. "You'll need to do this every few hours," she said. "Even at night." Daniel looked toward the clock. His shift began again that evening. Grace understood before he explained. "I can come by while you work." "You don't have to do that." "No, I don't." She closed the notebook. "But I will." Daniel wanted to ask why. Instead, he thanked her. Over the next several days, the storage room changed. The damaged cardboard box disappeared. Clean bedding replaced the wet towel. The puppies began lifting their heads when Daniel entered, and their cries became stronger. Grace tied loose ribbons around their necks so they could be identified without confusion. She used red for the female with the alert eyes, green for the broad male, yellow for the quiet one, blue for the puppy with the white paw, purple for the female who slept longer than the others, and no ribbon for the smallest male because Daniel always recognized him first. "He needs a name," Grace said one morning. Daniel watched the puppy climb over two sleeping siblings and crawl directly toward his boots. "Scout," Grace nodded. "Because he explores? Because he's always the first one looking for me." The red-ribboned female became Hazel. The broad male was Benny. The quiet one was Otis. The sleepy female became June. The puppy with the white paw was Patch. The names were supposed to be temporary. Daniel wrote them in Grace's notebook anyway. Grace rarely asked personal questions. She arrived before Daniel left for work, fed the puppies, changed the bedding, and noted everything in careful handwriting. Sometimes she stayed until he returned. One evening, Daniel found her sitting on the storage room floor with Hazel asleep in her lap. Scout was chewing the edge of her sleeve. Grace tried to pull the fabric away, but Scout followed it with surprising determination. She laughed so suddenly that Patch woke and barked once in confusion. Daniel smiled before he could stop himself. Grace noticed, but said nothing. Later, while they washed the feeding bottles in the kitchen, she looked toward the framed photograph of Ranger beside the window. "My son was a police officer," she said. Daniel turned off the faucet. Grace told him that Michael Holloway had joined the county department at 24 and served for 11 years. He had not died in the line of duty. A serious illness had taken him slowly more than 15 years earlier. "I still have his badge," she said. "It's in the top drawer of my dresser." Daniel waited. "For years, I couldn't pass the police station without thinking he might walk out the door," she continued. "So I stopped using that street." Her voice remained steady, but Daniel understood the habit. Grief often changed the roads people traveled. "You don't have to come here," he said. "I know." Grace dried a bottle and set it beside the sink. "That may be why coming matters." After she left, Daniel stood alone in the kitchen. From the storage room came the sound of paws scraping against wood, followed by a chorus of impatient cries. The house had once been silent enough for Daniel to hear the refrigerator switch on from the hallway. Now there were bottles on the counter, towels drying over chairs, and feeding times written across a notebook beside the coffee machine. There were small accidents on the floor. There were sharp cries at 2 a.m. There was Scout tugging at Daniel's socks and June falling asleep with her face in an empty food dish. Daniel continued telling Harold, Laura, and anyone else who asked that the arrangement was temporary. He said it often enough that it almost sounded convincing. Yet every night before turning off the heating lamp, Daniel knelt beside the wooden crate and counted them. Hazel, Benny, Otis, June, Patch, then Scout, usually closest to the edge. 6 puppies. Only when Daniel knew they were all there did he go upstairs to sleep. 3 weeks passed and the 6 puppies changed almost every day. Their legs became steadier, their voices grew stronger, and the small wooden crate that had once seemed too large could no longer contain their energy. By the middle of December, they had taken over most of Daniel's living room. Scout was usually the first to escape the puppy gate. He had learned that if he pushed his shoulder against the loose corner, the frame would shift just enough for him to squeeze through. Patch followed whenever he was brave enough, while Benny preferred to wait until Daniel opened the gate and then charge forward as if he had been released from captivity. Otis moved more carefully. June often stopped halfway across the rug to investigate shadows, chair legs, or dust caught in the morning light. Hazel had become the quickest of them all. She could steal Daniel's shoelace, race beneath the dining table, and disappear behind the sofa before he had time to bend down. The house no longer belonged entirely to him. There were chew marks on one table leg. A towel was always drying near the kitchen sink. Puppy toys appeared beneath furniture Daniel had not moved in years. Ranger's old cushion had been brought out of storage and placed near the fireplace, though the puppies rarely used it properly. They wrestled across it, dragged it through the room, and sometimes slept in a tangled pile beside it rather than on top of it. Daniel complained about the disorder whenever Grace was present. Grace never believed him. "You moved that cushion closer to the heater," she observed one morning. "It was blocking the cabinet." "It was on the other side of the room." Daniel looked down at Scout. who was chewing one of his boot laces. "I may have moved the cabinet." Grace smiled and continued filling the food bowls. The puppies were eating softened food now, though they still needed careful schedules and attention. Their personalities had become clearer, along with the attachments they had formed. Scout disliked being alone. If Daniel carried the others into the yard and left Scout behind for even a minute, the puppy cried and scratched at the gate until someone returned. Hazel and June were different. They could be separated from the rest of the litter, but not from each other. Hazel often checked the room before eating. If June was missing, she would leave her bowl untouched and begin searching. Benny and Otis had slept back-to-back since their first night beneath the bridge. Even as the others spread across the floor, those two usually found each other before settling down. Grace noticed these patterns before Daniel admitted they mattered. "They remember what happened," she said one afternoon. Daniel was repairing the puppy gate with an extra metal bracket. "They're young. That doesn't mean they've forgotten." He tightened the screw. "They'll adjust." Grace watched him for a moment. "Most creatures do. That doesn't make the leaving easy." The call from Laura Bennett came that evening. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing a patrol report while Scout slept beneath his chair. When his phone rang, he expected another update about vaccinations or paperwork. Laura sounded relieved. "We found homes," she said. "All 6. Daniel looked toward the living room. Hazel and June were pulling opposite ends of a cloth toy. Benny had fallen asleep with one paw across Otis's neck. "All 6 together?" The silence lasted less than a second, but it answered him. "No," Laura said. 6 approved families in 4 different towns. Every home has been checked. They're good people." Daniel leaned back in his chair. Laura continued carefully. One family had experience with German shepherds. Another had a fenced yard and an older dog. A retired couple wanted 2 puppies, but they had chosen Benny and Patch after seeing the photographs. Scout would go to a family near Harrisburg. Hazel had been matched with a schoolteacher in Willow Creek. Daniel listened as though she were reading a list of equipment transfers. On paper, the arrangements were better than anything he could provide alone. Each puppy would have food, shelter, veterinary care, and a family prepared to raise it. They would not remain crowded inside a small house with a man who worked nights and relied on a 71-year-old neighbor to keep his life from falling apart. "When?" he asked. "Saturday morning. We can begin with 2 families and arrange the others through the weekend." Daniel looked at Scout beneath the chair. "That soon?" "They're old enough now, and the longer they stay, the harder the transition may become." Daniel understood the reasoning. He had used similar words while helping new K9 handlers separate young dogs from foster homes. Structure mattered. Timing mattered. Attachment could complicate training. He gave Laura permission to proceed. After the call, he remained at the table until Grace arrived for the evening feeding. She knew something had changed before he told her. "They found homes," Daniel said. Grace placed her coat over the back of a chair. "For all of them?" He nodded. She looked toward the puppies. "Where?" "Different places." Grace did not argue. She asked for the details, wrote them in the notebook, and listened as Daniel explained why the placements made sense. 6 adult dogs would require far more room than he had. Food and medical care would cost more than he could comfortably afford. They would need daily exercise, training, and attention. His temporary reduced schedule was ending on Monday. Captain Miles had already informed him that he would return to full patrol duty. The department had allowed him to bring the puppies to the station twice during emergencies, but that arrangement could not continue. The dispatch office was not a kennel, and officers had begun taking turns cleaning accidents from the break room floor. There had also been a complaint from his neighbor, Mrs. Keene, a 66-year-old retired librarian who lived in the house to the east. She had been polite but firm. The puppies had begun barking before sunrise, and her bedroom faced Daniel's yard. Daniel had apologized. Every reasonable fact pointed in the same direction. The puppies had to go. Grace sat on the floor and allowed June to climb into her lap. "Do you want them to leave?" she asked. "That isn't the question." "It may be the only question you haven't answered." Daniel picked up an empty food bowl. What I want doesn't create more hours in a day. No. It doesn't make the house larger. No. It doesn't change what 6 dogs need. Grace stroked June's back. No, she said again, but wanting something still matters. Daniel carried the bowls into the kitchen and did not reply. The night before the first adoption, snow began falling over Birch Lane. It was light and dry, barely enough to cover the grass, but the puppies reacted as if the sky had opened for them alone. Daniel took them into the yard after dinner. Hazel tried to catch the flakes. Benny barked at his own footprints. Patch stepped into the snow, decided he disliked it, and climbed onto Daniel's boot. For 20 minutes, Daniel forgot about Saturday morning. Later, after Grace left, he checked the locks, turned down the lights, and gathered the puppies into the living room. They settled slowly. Scout was missing. Daniel searched beneath the table, behind the sofa, and inside the storage room. He found him upstairs in Daniel's bedroom. A wooden box sat open beside the closet. Daniel had taken out Ranger's collar earlier that week while searching for an old leash, then forgotten to close the lid. Scout lay on Ranger's folded blanket. His small muzzle rested across the worn K9 collar, and one paw was tucked beneath the metal buckle. Daniel stopped in the doorway. The collar still carried the scratches of 10 years of service. The brass identification plate had faded near the edges. Daniel had held it in his hands on the last evening of Ranger's life while the old dog slept beside him. He sat on the floor. Scout opened his eyes but did not move. Daniel reached toward the collar, then stopped. A memory came instead. His former wife, Rebecca, had stood near the front door with 2 suitcases 6 years earlier. She had been 40 at the time and worked as a hospital administrator. She had not been angry when she left. That had made the moment harder. She told Daniel that he still loved his family, but he had hidden that love behind silence, work, and grief until no one could feel it. "You keep closing doors," she had said, "one after another. Someday you'll look around and wonder why nobody is inside." Daniel had believed she did not understand him. Now he wondered whether she had understood too well. He carried Scout downstairs and placed him beside the others. Scout immediately pressed against Hazel and June, then fell asleep. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. The first family came just after 9. Mark and Elise Turner were a married couple in their early 50s who owned a small printing business in Willow Creek. They had raised 2 dogs before and had been approved to adopt Hazel. Elise knelt on the living room rug and allowed Hazel to approach her. Mark spoke gently and offered a small toy. They were patient, prepared, and clearly kind. Daniel could find no reason to distrust them. When Elise wrapped Hazel in a clean blanket, Scout began whining. June pushed against the puppy gate. Benny and Otis woke and hurried toward the door. Hazel twisted in Elise's arms, looking toward the others. Daniel opened the front door. The cold entered first. Elise carried Hazel toward the car. Scout and June followed as far as the gate allowed, crying with a sharpness Daniel had never heard from them before. He stood still. This was the correct decision. Mark opened the passenger door. Elise turned to place Hazel inside. Hazel struggled free of the top of the blanket and stretched her neck toward the house. Her eyes found the doorway, the other puppies, and Daniel. For one moment, nobody moved. Daniel felt the same terrible stillness he had known years before, when Rebecca placed her suitcase in the car and waited for him to say something that might have changed everything. He had said nothing then. Now, Hazel gave one small cry. Daniel finally understood that he was not simply watching a puppy leave. He was standing at another open door, preparing to let a family disappear because admitting he needed them frightened him more than losing them. Daniel stepped off the porch before Elise could place Hazel inside the car. "Please wait." Mark and Elise turned toward him. Hazel was still twisting inside the blanket, her eyes fixed on the doorway where the other puppies were crying. Daniel crossed the yard slowly, aware that he had no complete explanation and no plan strong enough to justify what he was about to ask. "I need 2 more days," he said. Elise looked down at Hazel, then back at him. "Is something wrong with her?" "No, she's healthy. You haven't done anything wrong. Then what is it? Daniel glanced toward the house. Scout had pushed his nose through the bars of the gate. June stood pressed beside him. I need to know whether separating them this way is the right thing. Mark's expression remained careful. We were told the placement was final. It may still be. I'm only asking for 48 hours. Elise held Hazel closer. The puppy had stopped struggling, but she continued watching the house. After a quiet discussion, the couple agreed. They were disappointed, though not unkind. Daniel apologized twice and carried Hazel back inside. The moment she crossed the doorway, Scout and June crowded around her. Benny and Otis joined them, while Patch climbed onto the edge of the blanket. Hazel disappeared beneath the others until only her ears remained visible. Daniel stood over the litter and felt relief first. Fear followed immediately. Laura called within the hour. She listened as Daniel explained that he wanted 2 days to consider other options. Her response was patient but firm. You can delay the transfers, she said. You cannot delay the decision forever. I understand. The county approved these families because your home was listed as temporary care. Keeping 6 growing dogs requires more space, a secure outdoor area, veterinary records, and a long-term care plan. I'll prepare one. Daniel, I'm not trying to take them from you. I'm trying to make sure they are safe when they are no longer small enough to sleep in one crate. He looked across the living room. Benny was chewing the corner of the rug. Patch had discovered the newspaper beside the fireplace and was slowly tearing it into strips. I asked for 2 days. Laura sighed. You have 2 days. Daniel began with numbers. He sat at the kitchen table and listed everything 6 dogs would need during their first year. Food, vaccinations, licensing, preventive medicine, spaying and neutering, training classes, larger crates, stronger gates, a secure fence around the yard. He added emergency veterinary costs and stopped when the total reached more than he could comfortably save in several months. The old backyard fence leaned near the alley and had gaps wide enough for a puppy to squeeze through. Replacing it would cost nearly as much as the medical care. His work schedule would require paid help on nights when Grace was unavailable. Daniel tried the calculation again, removing everything that was not immediately necessary. The number remained too high. By late afternoon, Grace found him at the table surrounded by papers, receipts, and estimates printed from the computer. She read the total without speaking. I can contribute, she said. Daniel shook his head. I have savings. No? You haven't even asked how much. It doesn't matter. Grace pulled out the chair across from him. It matters to me. You have already spent 3 weeks feeding them, cleaning after them, and changing your entire schedule. I chose to. You should not use your retirement money to solve my problem. Grace's eyes narrowed. Your problem? Daniel realized his mistake but continued anyway. I brought them home. I made the call. I'm responsible. And I am what? A visitor? That isn't what I said. It is close enough. Grace stood and walked toward the living room. The puppies followed her immediately. Hazel caught the hem of her coat. Scout sat on her shoe as if claiming it. Grace looked down at them, then turned back toward Daniel. You think these dogs only came here to save you? I never said they saved me. No? You would rather call it temporary care? Her voice was sharper than Daniel had ever heard it. For 15 years, I avoided the road past the police station because I could not stand the memories. I stopped visiting friends who asked about Michael. I ate meals alone and told myself I preferred the quiet. Daniel remained silent. Then you walked into that store holding the wrong milk and looking like a man who had been given 6 lives he did not know how to protect. Grace bent and lifted June into her arms. These puppies gave me a reason to open my front door in the morning. They gave me somewhere to be. Helping them is not a burden you placed on me. It is one of the first things in years that has made me feel useful. Daniel pushed the papers aside. I don't want you losing what you have left. Grace's expression softened only slightly. And I don't want you deciding for me what my life is worth. A sound came from the kitchen. The back door struck the wall. Both of them turned. Cold wind moved through the room, lifting the papers from the table. Daniel crossed the kitchen and found the rear door open. The storm door beyond it had not latched, and the gate at the end of the yard swung against the fence. He counted the puppies: Hazel, Benny, Otis, June. Patch. Scout was gone. Daniel ran into the yard without his coat. The grass was wet from a steady afternoon rain. Small paw prints crossed the mud near the gate, then disappeared on the sidewalk. Grace came behind him carrying a flashlight. He could not have gone far. Daniel looked toward the end of Birch Lane. Scout had always followed Daniel. He had followed his siblings. He had followed familiar smells through every room of the house. Then Daniel thought of the blanket, the wet cardboard box, and the roadside where the litter had been found. Foundry Road. Grace understood immediately. They took Daniel's car and searched the streets between Birch Lane and the industrial district. The rain strengthened as evening settled over Millstone. Headlights reflected across the pavement, and every dark shape near the curb forced Daniel to slow. He called Scout's name through the open window. There was no answer. Near the old railway crossing, Grace saw small tracks beside a drainage channel. Daniel stopped the vehicle and followed them on foot until they vanished beneath running water. Scout had traveled farther than either of them believed possible. By the time they reached the bridge, darkness had covered the road. Trucks passed through sheets of rain, throwing water across the shoulder. Daniel left the emergency lights flashing and ran toward the culvert. The original box was gone, removed during the roadside cleanup. Only several pieces of softened cardboard remained caught beneath weeds near the ditch. Then Grace pointed toward the pavement. There! Scout was curled beside one of the wet cardboard pieces only a few feet from the road. His coat was soaked flat against his body. He was facing the place where his mother had died. Daniel moved toward him. Scout lifted his head. A truck horn sounded through the rain. Daniel looked left and saw a large freight truck approaching around the curve. Its headlights filled the fog, and the vehicle was too close to stop quickly on the wet road. Scout panicked and stepped onto the pavement. Daniel ran. He reached the puppy as the horn sounded again, louder than before. Daniel grabbed Scout against his chest and threw his weight toward the drainage ditch. They struck the grass and rolled down the slope. The truck passed above them in a rush of water, wind, and heavy tires. For several seconds, Daniel could hear nothing except his own breathing. Scout was pressed beneath his arms. The puppy trembled, but moved. Grace reached them moments later. Her hands shook as she helped Daniel sit upright. "You're bleeding." Daniel touched his forehead and found a shallow cut near his temple. His shoulder hurt from the fall, but he could move it. "Check, Scout." Grace wrapped the puppy inside her coat. "He's breathing. We need a veterinarian." Millstone Animal Clinic was still open when they arrived. Dr. Ellen Price, a 49-year-old veterinarian who had treated working dogs and household pets for more than 20 years, examined Scout while Daniel sat in the waiting room with mud drying across his uniform. Scout had mild hypothermia, several scrapes, and exhaustion, but no broken bones or serious internal injuries. Daniel closed his eyes when Ellen gave them the news. Grace sat beside him after Scout had been placed beneath warm blankets. "A family does not have to sleep under one roof," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her. Benny and Otis could live together. Hazel and June could be close enough to see each other. Scout could stay with you. They could still train together, play together, and remain part of one another's lives. Daniel stared through the clinic window at Scout. The idea began with the old K-9 building behind the police station. It had been unused since the department ended its expanded dog program. The structure had fenced training space, storage rooms, and a small indoor area. Daniel could not own 6 dogs alone. The community might care for 6 dogs together. By the time they returned home, Daniel had written the beginning of a plan. 3 puppies could live with him and Grace. The others could be adopted by nearby residents who agreed to weekly group training. In time, the dogs could visit isolated seniors, veterans, and families facing grief. Captain Miles rejected the proposal the next morning. "There is no budget," he said. "No staff, no insurance plan. The old kennel needs repairs, and the town will not accept liability because 6 puppies made you emotional." Daniel accepted every objection. Then he asked to address the town council. Harold studied him for a long moment. "You know they will ask why this matters." "I know. You may have to tell them more than you've told anyone here." Daniel thought of Ranger, Rebecca, Grace, and Scout beside the road. "For once," he said, "I'm going to." He was not asking Millstone to save him. He was asking the town to help 6 abandoned dogs become companions for people who believed loneliness had become permanent. The town council met on a cold Thursday evening in the Millstone Municipal Hall, where rows of folding chairs faced a long wooden table beneath the town seal. Daniel stood near the front with Grace beside him and Scout resting quietly at his feet. Captain Miles had warned him that the council would ask practical questions. They would want costs, schedules, insurance details, and proof that the old K9 building could be made safe. Daniel had prepared answers for all of them. What he had not prepared was the part about himself. When his name was called, Daniel walked to the microphone and placed both hands against the wooden stand. He began with the facts. 6 puppies had been abandoned beneath the bridge on Foundry Road. Their mother had died searching for food. The county shelter had found separate homes, but the puppies had formed strong bonds with one another. Then Daniel looked at the people seated before him. He spoke about Ranger. He told them how the old German Shepherd had worked beside him for more than 10 years, then waited for him at home after retirement. He explained that when Ranger died, the house had become so quiet that Daniel sometimes left the radio playing in an empty room. He also spoke briefly about Rebecca and the end of his marriage. He did not blame her. He admitted that grief had made him distant and that he had mistaken silence for strength. "The puppies need homes," Daniel said, "but Millstone also has people who need a reason to open their doors again." He described a trial program using the old K9 building behind the station. Local families would adopt the puppies, but all 6 would return for weekly training. In time, they could visit nursing homes, schools, veterans, and residents living alone. He was not asking the town to keep 6 dogs for him. He was asking them to build something useful from 6 lives that had nearly been lost. For several moments after Daniel finished, the room remained quiet. Then a man in the second row raised his hand. Samuel Reed was a 69-year-old retired carpenter who had built houses across Millstone for more than 40 years. He stood slowly and looked toward the council. "I inspected that K9 building last spring," Samuel said. "The roof needs work, and 2 interior walls have water damage, nothing I can't fix." A council member asked what the repairs would cost. Samuel shrugged. "Materials. And labor? I have more time than money these days. The town can have the time." Another voice came from the back of the room. Dr. Ellen Price rose and offered vaccinations, health checks, and reduced-cost medical care through Millstone Animal Clinic. A third person stood near the aisle. Thomas Bell, 52, managed the local farm supply store that had replaced Grace's old business. He promised to provide food for the puppies during the first year if the program received approval. The room changed slowly after that. People who had arrived, prepared to question Daniel, began offering what they knew how to give. A retired teacher volunteered to help with record keeping. A mechanic offered to repair the damaged kennel doors. 2 high school students asked whether they could clean the training yard on weekends. The council did not approve the entire plan that night. Government decisions rarely moved that quickly. They formed a committee, requested inspections, and asked the town attorney to examine the liability requirements. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in the same room when the vote was taken. The program was approved for a 1-year trial. They named it Ranger's Second Watch. The official paperwork described it as a community companion dog initiative. Daniel preferred Grace's explanation. Dogs helping lonely people find one another. The old K9 building came back to life before spring. Samuel repaired the roof and replaced the damaged walls. Volunteers painted the rooms, reinforced the fencing, and built low platforms for training. Ellen installed a small medical cabinet, while Thomas delivered the first stack of food bags without sending an invoice. The 6 puppies did not remain beneath one roof, but none of them disappeared from the others' lives. Daniel adopted Scout and Patch. Scout still followed him from room to room, while Patch became calmer and preferred sleeping near the kitchen heater. Grace adopted Hazel. Because Grace lived 3 streets away rather than beside Daniel, Samuel helped build matching gates in both back fences and a secure walking path through the shared alley garden between their properties. Daniel and Grace began opening those gates during the day, allowing the 3 dogs to move safely between the 2 yards whenever one of them was home. June was adopted by Evelyn Carter, a 59-year-old widowed nurse who worked at a small rehabilitation center outside Millstone. Evelyn had spent most of her adult life caring for others and had struggled with the silence of her home after her husband died. June began sleeping beside her bed during the first week. Benny and Otis went together to Frank and Martha Doyle, a retired couple in their late 60s who owned a small sheep farm north of town. They had enough land for both dogs and had refused to consider taking only one. "We have watched them sleep back to back," Martha told Daniel. "Some promises should not be broken." Every Sunday afternoon, the 6 dogs returned to the old training yard. The first sessions were disorderly. Scout chased the training cones. Hazel stole treats from Daniel's pocket. Benny and Otis refused to walk in separate directions. June sat beside Evelyn and watched everyone with calm interest, while Patch rolled onto his back whenever someone asked him to stay. Grace carried a clipboard and recorded every mistake. Before long, the volunteers began calling her the real captain of Ranger's second watch. Captain Miles pretended to object, though he was usually the first person to ask Grace what needed to be done. The puppies learned slowly. They practiced walking beside people with canes and wheelchairs. They learned not to jump when greeting older residents. They became comfortable around medical equipment, children's voices, and unfamiliar rooms. June completed her first visit to Evelyn's rehabilitation center. She sat beside an 82-year-old patient who had refused to join group activities for nearly a month. The man spoke to June for 20 minutes. Scout visited the local veterans meeting hall. He spent most of the afternoon beside a former truck driver who said he had not touched a dog since losing his own many years earlier. The dogs did not perform miracles. They simply stayed. Often, that was enough. One afternoon, Grace brought a small wooden frame to the K9 building. Inside it was Michael's old police badge. She hung it beside a photograph of Ranger near the entrance. For 15 years, the badge had remained hidden in a drawer. Now, Grace stood before it without turning away. Daniel did not say anything. He placed one hand on her shoulder, and they watched the 6 young dogs running across the training yard. A year after the council vote, Millstone held the official opening ceremony for Ranger's second watch. The puppies were no longer puppies. They had grown into strong, healthy young dogs, each with a different nature but the same immediate recognition whenever the group came together. Scout crossed the yard first when Daniel arrived. He placed both front paws against Daniel's knees and looked up at him with the same alert expression he had worn as a tiny puppy trying to crawl from the wet box. Daniel rested a hand against Scout's neck. Beyond the training yard, the lights of Birch Lane appeared through the evening trees. Grace had left soup warming on Daniel's stove. Patch was expected to sleep near the kitchen. Hazel would probably claim Ranger's old cushion before Grace took her home. Benny, Otis, and June would remain until their families finished talking after the ceremony. There would be hair on the floor, wet paws near the door, and more dishes than Daniel had owned a year earlier. The house would not be quiet. Daniel had once believed his chance to have a family ended when Rebecca left and Ranger died. He understood now that a family did not always return in the shape a person remembered. Sometimes it arrived in separate homes connected by open gates. Sometimes it gathered every Sunday in an old K9 yard. Sometimes it appeared beside a road in a collapsing box, cold and frightened, asking for nothing more than one person willing to stop. Daniel opened the training gate. The 6 dogs turned toward him at once. "Come on," he called. "Let's go home." Scout ran first. Patch and Hazel followed. June came beside them while Benny and Otis raced shoulder to shoulder across the yard. Daniel watched all 6 coming toward him. For the first time in many years, he knew he would not return to an empty house alone. Sometimes the family we need does not arrive in the way we expected. It may come through a neighbor who chooses to help, a small animal that needs care, or a simple moment when we decide not to walk away. Daniel believed his life had become too quiet to change. But by opening his door to 6 abandoned puppies, he also opened his heart to friendship, purpose, and hope. His story reminds us that kindness does not always solve everything at once. Sometimes it simply gives someone a reason to keep going. In daily life, we may never know how much a small act of care can mean to a lonely person or a frightened animal. A phone call, a warm meal, a patient conversation, or the decision to stop and help may become the beginning of a new chapter. What lesson did you take from Daniel and the 6 puppies? Please share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe that love can rebuild a broken heart, comment Amen below. Please like this story, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about loyalty, healing, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your home with peace, love, and hope.